This video is part of a series I am working on exploring anarchist texts collected in Robert Graham's anthology, Anarchism, A Documentary History of Libertarian Ideas, a 3-volume collection. My goal is to provide commentary and analysis of anarchist texts to bring awareness of these writings to a broader audience and consider how these texts are historically significant. My goals are analytical and historical rather than practical, but to the degree that these videos inspire or help movements, I will be pleased. In this video, I will examine a short selection from William Godwin's An Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, a book often described as the founding text of a tradition known as philosophical anarchism. Philosophical anarchism refers to movements, or ideas I should say, that are typically separate from movement cultures. They question the state and capitalism and hierarchies. They present philosophical arguments against them, but they are not generally very active in revolutionary movements, sometimes for good reasons, fearing revolution as a force that will lead to new states and systems of oppression. Other times it's because they believe that Enlightenment, this is something Godwin believed, that Enlightenment is the path out and gradually societies will evolve towards anarchism. They're also very individualist, focusing on moral claims by individuals to refuse to serve rather than movements aiming to overthrow the state. William Godwin is a particular type of individualist anarchist that sees the end of the state as a product of gradual enlightenment, but there are other strains of this tradition. William Godwin wrote his massive work, An Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, between 1791 and 1793. When it was published in an expensive multi-volume edition that cost £1, which was quite a lot of money in those days. That is, but he wrote it during the most radical phase of the French Revolution. In part due to the density of this book, he later wrote a literary interpretation of his own writing called Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams. This novel follows the narrator Caleb Williams as he is hounded by various institutions throughout his life, despite being an innocent person. These institutions are not merely those of the state, however, and he's flustered by many different forces in his society running throughout his life. Now, it should be noted that William Godwin was married to Mary Wollstonecraft, an early feminist, but they didn't really meet until after Political Justice was published, so it's hard to identify any direct influence Mary Wollstonecraft had on his ideas. But the stuff Godwin wrote after he met Mary Wollstonecraft may be worth looking at for a window into how she changed some of his ideas. Now, the overall argument of political justice is that institutions restrict the progress of humanity. Now, this seems simple, but it is a notable work because it is one of the first, if not the first, conscious and deliberate argument made that government is unnecessary and that human beings will be better off without government. Most of the Enlightenment thinkers, even those who talked about the state of nature as being a positive time, or a time where people generally were happy and equal and even possibly prosperous, tended to see the current world as better off with government. You know, either a necessary evil or something that protected rights or something like that. In Godwin's point of view, the process of enlightenment leads to the destruction of these institutions, in particular the destruction of government. In the Graham anthology of anarchist writings, we're given over 8 pages. Now, this is pretty long by the standards of this book, which tends to collect these selections in small bits. But on the other hand, this barely scratches the surface of this massive text. It was published in 2 big volumes. And the book is not edited in such a way that we can really know what parts of political justice these selections come from. We're not given very careful footnotes here, but we can still get a general idea of his thoughts from this selection. So I think it's worth reading simply for a window into this thinker. But I have to apologize that I can't give a full analysis of the text, and I can only really here be fragmentary and introductory. Now, Godwin does begin with the same question Etienne de la Boétie began with, and that is, why should anyone accept the rule of a monarch? But Godwin expands on this in a couple ways. First, he refuses to accept that all people must be cowards, as de la Boétie does. He doesn't think this is the reason for it. He thinks there's something else going on, and this leads into his second way he ventures away from de la Boétie's interpretation, And that is, he doesn't focus on a single monarch ever. He doesn't talk about the king as the problem. Instead, he focuses on positive governmental institutions. So he really sees the bureaucracy, all the structures of state, and their emulators throughout society. Now, I break up the main argument presented in these few pages into 8 parts. They're in no particular order. They often overlap. And it's not like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bullet-pointed essay. So I just grabbed certain ideas from this passage. Now, the first of these is hierarchy is bad for us. Godwin was greatly concerned with the negative impact of hierarchies on individuals. He says this in many ways throughout the text. Quote, "Man is not originally vicious. He would not refuse to listen to or be convinced by the expostulations that are addressed to him had he not been accustomed to regard them as hypocritical." And later he writes, "The direct tendency of coercion is to set our understanding and our fears, our duty and our weaknesses at variance with each other. Coercion first annihilates the understanding of the subject upon whom it is exercised, and then him who employs it." In other words, hierarchy destroys our natural tendencies and degrades both the oppressor and the oppressed. Both the slave and the master are degraded by this relationship. He also makes a case that hierarchy makes us stupid because it convinces through violence rather than reason. Argument, debate, and thought don't enter into it while, quote, alienating the mind from the truth, end quote. So hierarchy is bad for us. A second thing he says is that revolution is not a way out of the problem of government and institutions and social hierarchies. Godwin doesn't directly question the French Revolution in the passage I have, but it must have been on his mind at the time, since this was written during the height of the Great French Revolution. He wrote, "Revolution is engendered by an indignation against tyranny, yet it itself even more pregnant with tyranny. The tyranny which excites its indignation can scarcely be without its partisans. Thus revolution simply creates new divisions." So it's worse than the kind of meet the old boss or meet the new boss, same as the old boss problem. Revolutions based on violence actually set back the gradual social progress that he thinks will lead to greater justice. Quote, "Revolutions disturb the harmony of intellectual nature." So if not violence, what is the response to tyranny? For Godwin, it must be a form of engagement. Revolution is at its best just another type of representative government, maybe with a changing of those doing the representing and the groups represented. It seems that engagement means a type of direct democracy where all people are active in the politics of society is necessary. But even I hesitate to say democracy because he does have fears about minority points of views, and he does see representative government as a tyranny of the majority. So anyways, revolution is not a way out. Third, there is a gradual progress towards enlightenment and simplicity. For Godwin, enlightenment has to be the way out, because only a, quote, universal sense of mankind, end quote, can provide a general inoculation against the creeping power of hierarchies and force. He wrote, "The only method according to which social improvement can be carried out with sufficient prospect of an auspicious event is when the improvement of our institutions advance in just proportion to the illumination of the public understanding. Poor institutions will fall away without the need for revolution. They will be just unnecessary because progress will come through enlightenment." But he also thinks the result of this process will be simplification. Imperfect institutions will not be reformed or remade or developed. Bad policies won't be replaced with better policies. They'll simply evaporate and leave an enlightened people behind who can rule themselves. So, process towards enlightenment. Fourth, Godwin believes that representative institutions fail. Now, Godwin makes this point in reference to the problem of revolution, but it's really more general than this. They complicate decisions that can be made simply and directly by the people, but they also lie because they present the image of agreement and unanimity when in fact it's the active repression of a minority by a majority. The winner-take-all representative system presents this idea of one representative for a whole population, but in fact, he's just representing the people who voted, right? The majority. And that's just the majority of the voters. Often that's a minority of the overall population. Minority voices are entirely abolished in this feigned unanimity. Quote, representative government is necessarily imperfect. It is a point to be regretted in the abstract notion of civil society that a majority should overbear a minority, and that a minority, after having opposed and remonstrated, should be obliged practically to submit to what was once the subject of their remonstrance, end quote. So in other words, representative institutions can be nothing more than just another type of hierarchy or government, in this case, the government of a majority over a minority. So we cannot put our faith in representative institutions. A fifth point Godwin makes is that human viciousness comes from social systems and from government. Godwin seems to think that all social relations, at least those that are hierarchical, are derived from the government relation. Or perhaps it's the other way around, but later on in another part in the book, he does say explicitly our social relations are parroting government. Any hierarchical relationship is futile. Any conflict resolution is predetermined, for instance, right? If you have a hierarchical relationship, there's no debate there. I mean, you can have, any debate would be a feigned debate, a fake debate, a false, just the facade of a debate, because at the end of the day, the more powerful actor will be victorious. And therefore, any conclusion is predetermined. Justice cannot, therefore, exist within them. Quote, the argument against political coercion is equally strong against the infliction of private penalties between master and slave and between parent and child. The right of the parent over his offspring lies either in his superior strength or in his superior reason, end quote. So if it's reason, the reasonable can rely on argument. If it's strength, it's nothing but straight up barbarism. And so he seems to think that all social relations are really based on violence and hierarchy, not on reason. And one of the process of evolution will replace this violence with more egalitarian dialogues and reason. This part of Godwin's argument makes him applicable to many types of social oppression, I believe. And like all good anarchists, Godwin certainly doesn't think everything is just about government. It is about the broad swath of social relations. So, well, moving on to his sixth point that I see here, and that is that government replicates itself in social relations. This is almost a simple development or even a corollary of the previous point, but it's worth separating out and considering. He does seem to think that social relations come from government, and the idea of government is based on force. Quote, ambition and tumult are evils that arise out of government in an indirect manner, in consequence of habits, which government introduces of concert and combination extending themselves over multitudes of man, end quote. In other words, the kind of the sinful values, the vices that are at the foundation of all hierarchical social relations are themselves consequences of habits that government introduces into our societies. So government is replicated throughout our society in our many different social relations. Point 7 that Godwin made is to each according to their needs. Godwin, although not often understood or studied as a communist, does make an argument that property is evil because it denies each person what they need to survive. These points on property were so controversial, some versions of Godwin's texts took these passages out. He takes for granted, for instance, the basic right to survival as a necessary component of a just society, but he also goes further and discusses the right of to leisure and the right to have comfort and the right to have intellectual curiosity and the time and the comfort it takes to enjoy those things. The way he puts it is, quote, justice does not stop here at subsistence. Every man is entitled, so far as the general stock will suffice, not only to the means of being, but of well-being. It is unjust if one man labor to the destruction of his health or his life, that another man may abound in luxuries. It is unjust if one man be deprived of leisure to cultivate his rational powers, while another man contributes not a single effort to aid to the common stock. End quote. In this sense, he seems to foreshadow Oscar Wilde's argument in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he argued that socialism is a foundation for intellectual freedom. Right? It's not the ultimate goal for Wilde of socialism was not just material equality between people, but kind of a liberation of the intellectual and intellectual freedom from, well, because people then would have time and they'd be released from all these concerns about the well-being of other people and charity and, you know, all these practical political concerns that that derive from the fact that we have inequality in society. That would free us up to be artists and thinkers. And then point 8, that would be that political and economic inequality causes crime. The vices that cause crime are based on the established system of property, according to Godwin. Selfishness creates the need to defend property from others, creating in turn the concept of crime. As he says this quite directly, the fruitful sources of crime consist in this circumstance, one man's possessing in abundance that which another man is destitute. End quote. But before we can have social equality, we need to have enlightenment. The proper method for curing this inequality is by reason and not by violence. On this point, Godwin seems to agree with Winstanley, who also believed that crime, and Winstanley even goes into deriving from crime the legal institutions, courts and lawyers and all that, and I think Godwin would certainly agree with that, but these are both unnecessary outgrowths of private property. Or I guess necessary outgrowths of private property, but both should be abolished as unnecessary to an enlightened and just society. So crime is rooted in private property. Now these are the main points I pulled out from this very short passage from a very long philosophical text. But whatever you think of his overall points of view, maybe things he missed or contradictions in his thought, his ideas seem to speak to many issues that anarchists to this day agree on. In particular, the depth of inequality across all social relations, not just resting in government, but actually resting in all our interpersonal relations. You know, the injustice of private property is broadly agreed upon by anarchists, and the questioning of representative democracy in violent revolution. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe to see more of my videos on anarchist texts or follow my reviews on American writers. In my next video, I'll examine 2 other texts that came out of the French Revolution, Jean Varlet's The Explosion and Sylvain Marchal's The Manifesto of Equals.